Anyhow, let's just have a look. Hopefully that answers Magnus's question. So yeah, it's absolutely a kind of hybrid approach. I tend to build off the rhythms as the fundamental part of the platform. Then I'll move into the MIDI parts, and finally kind of onto other MIDI parts that are more of the sort of production parts, I guess, the window dressing parts, and then anything kind of almost like, I would say, these sci-fi whooshes, the big kind of white noise whooshes that you typically hear on a track like this. These are, more kind of they're really essential parts for that organic flow, so that you're building the expectation up to the end of an 8-bar drop, and then allowing people that chance to sort of sink in and almost surf the wave of the music. But they're not things that I would really even consider until I was really in the final throes of putting the track together. So I'm just going to quickly look at these drums with you. You guys have any more questions, please just don't be shy, drop them in the chat. I'm all about answering them as completely and honestly as I can. So I'll just play a little bit of the rhythms towards the back end of the track, so you can kind of, just get a feel for how they all sit together. So you can see from, I don't know how many parts there are there. There must be, 13, something like that. Actually, for a kind of house track, for me, that's probably fairly typical. I'd say something around that number of parts. I would describe myself very much as a kind of wall of sound style producer in many ways. And I don't mean the label wall of sound. I just mean the kind of wall of sound principle. I love layers. I think you have to be very careful when you're applying them, because you need to have an understanding of the function of each component within those layers. But I do love building up these kind of complex audio structures that are really sort of really rich and thick and dynamic sounding. So, if we just kind of zoom out for a second, I think they're probably as small as they're going to go. Let's see if we can just make those a touch smaller. There we go. Okay, so if we zoom out of the rhythm track as a whole, you can pretty much see, we've got this chunky loop happening here. It's very straightforward. Got a snare loop, and the snare loop here is simply thickening up the chunky loop, so it's just really adding to the thickness of the snare there, because the snare's a little bit on the light side. In fact, in a way, it's more of a kind of clap. And then we have a hi-hat just on the offbeat, just like a semi-closed 909 style hat. And then we have our main thumping kick. Usually with kicks, occasionally I'll I'll grab a kick that's kind of off the shelf, that's come from a sample pack. A lot of the time I like them to be unique, so I'll usually look at using 2 or 3 different kick samples. Generally speaking, you have to be really, really careful when you're layering, well, when you're layering any sounds, but with kick drums particularly, there's such a major issue around the sort of phase of bass frequencies, where, you know, if you have, and I'm sure you guys know this, but if you have, if you have like sine wave type frequencies in the same sort of hertz bands as each other within these different kick samples, they will start cancelling each other out, like phase cancellation. And that'll be a disaster, because you'll hear, and I used to have this when I first started out, you know, back in the 90s, back in the early 90s, I used to have this all the time, and it just used to do my head in. I'd have a couple of kicks running on tracks, and I'd listen back to them, and very, very randomly, every like 9th kick drum or 13th kick drum or something, it just wouldn't be as punchy as the others. And then you'd start really tuning into it and realizing that actually, yeah, that, you know, they were kind of cancelling each other out. It's now so much easier than it used to be to kind of contain that. So, for example, you know, I use probably my go-to EQ for sort of surgical stuff is the Tokyo Dawn Nova EQ at the moment. I did used to use the Fab Filter ones, but you know, I really like the Nova, because it's also kind of responsive to audio. So it's almost like a kind of glorified, it's almost like a glorified multi-band compressor in many ways. But if we just look at this kick sound, get a really nice display there of the waveform. And it's easy enough. If you have, say, 2 kick drums coming together, you just want to put a high pass filter on. I usually give it a fairly aggressive slope so I can control it. And say with this kick drum, maybe I'm not that keen on exactly what the bottom end is doing. So perhaps I'll put in a high pass filter, I'll take the bottom end out of it entirely, and then bring a dedicated kind of subsonic kick in to fill in that bottom end exactly as I want. And then, you know, just have a very, very narrow amount of sort of overspill there, so it doesn't sound unnatural. So it doesn't sound like there's suddenly a big hole, a big notch in the sound. And that's, you know, when I put this track together, I would imagine that's probably what I did with this kick. Usually I'll find that if I want something that's a bit more kind of live sounding, I'll go for the bottom end will be something that's much deeper, more electronic based. It will come from a drum machine or a synthesizer or whatever. But when I'm looking for that sort of real mid-range punch, then I'll be looking for a kick that's perhaps more of a kind of an acoustic sound. And in order to constrain that, you might be looking to roll off some of the top end, and then that kind of the little thump that you hear, where almost like the beater of the kick comes down onto the skin on the bass drum. Maybe you take a third kick and you might find something that just really had a nice kind of punch to it. And then you just sit all three together, just work out if they sound like they belong in the same sort of sound world. And if they do some processing, do that kind of audio work, get really surgical with the EQ particularly, and then export, bounce it down, do whatever you need to do with the sort of compression, just to gel it all together, and then move on. I really don't like to put these tracks together where I say I get into this stage of the track where I have all of these different parts that I'm working on, I don't want to be thinking about three different components to a kick drum, because it very, very quickly escalates into something that's really quite unmanageable, in terms of sort of project size. So that's the way I tend to look at kick drums.